He had agreed to the match without meeting her. That was his first mistake. Alpha King Kalen Dawnfang, ruler of 7 pack territories, commander of 30,000 wolves, the most politically calculated man in the known packlands, had agreed to bond marry a woman he had never seen based on 3 things: a diplomatic necessity, a council recommendation, and a description from Lord Brennan's envoy that used the word plain twice and unremarkable once. He had accepted this. A bond marriage was political architecture. He did not need remarkable. He needed stable, compliant, and willing to stand at his side during state ceremonies without causing complications. Plain would do. He stood at the altar of the Ironmark Bond Hall on the morning of the ceremony and watched the doors at the far end of the hall open. She walked in alone. No attendants, no flowers. A simple gown that the court had clearly provided in haste because it fit poorly at the shoulders, and a veil so thick he could not make out a single feature beneath it. Plain, he thought. Unremarkable. He watched her walk the length of the hall. Her pace was steady. Her spine was straight. She did not look at the assembled court, hundreds of packlords in their attendants, every eye in the room fixed on the woman they'd been told was so unfortunate in appearance that the Brennan family had requested she be veiled for the ceremony. She looked only at him. Even through the veil, he could feel it. The quality of her attention. Direct and unhurried, with the specific character of someone who has already decided something and is simply carrying out the decision. She stopped before him. The Bond Elder began the ceremony. When the moment came for the veil to lift, Kalen reached forward. His fingers found the edge of the fabric. He lifted it. And the life he had planned, the careful, strategic, controlled life of a king who had made every decision correctly, fell completely apart. Let me tell you how it had been arranged. 6 weeks before the ceremony, Lord Brennan, the most senior council lord in the Ironmark pack, a man of 60 with the patient, calculating intelligence of someone who had been building something for a very long time, had come to the Alpha King with a proposal. The Brennan pack held the eastern border. The eastern border held the only viable trade route between Ironmark and the Coldwater territories. The relationship between Brennan and the Crown had been politely strained for 4 years, ever since Kalen had overruled Brennan's faction on the Northern Territory redistribution. A bond between the families would resolve this cleanly. Brennan had a ward, an Omega, 24 years old, raised in his household, technically of good blood, but practically insignificant. The girl's parents had died when she was young. She had no allies, no independent resources, no political standing of her own. "She's not what you'd call remarkable," Brennan's envoy had said, choosing his words with care. "Plain in appearance, quiet, compliant. She'll cause no difficulty." Kalen had looked at the match from every angle. The border resolution was worth it. The political consolidation was worth it. The girl herself was, by the envoy's account, exactly what he needed, someone who would be present at state occasions and absent from state decisions. He had agreed. He had not asked to meet her. This was, he would later understand, exactly what Brennan had counted on. What Lord Brennan had not told the Alpha King. The ward's name was Lyra. Lyra was not plain. Lyra was not unremarkable. Lyra was, and this was the fact that Brennan had been managing, containing, and hiding for 3 years with the focused intensity of someone protecting an extremely inconvenient truth. Extraordinary. Not in the performative, ornamental way of court beauties, in a way that was considerably more dangerous. She was brilliant. She had read every political record in Brennan's library. Twice, she had learned 4-pack dialects from the trade merchants who came through the eastern border holdings. She had, at 21, quietly identified a corruption arrangement in Brennan's border levy collection that was costing the eastern pack communities significant resources, and had documented it in a private record she'd kept hidden for 3 years. She had not confronted Brennan with this. She understood with the precise clarity of someone who had been powerless for a very long time that confronting Brennan directly would accomplish nothing except her removal from the household. She would wait. She would watch. She would find the moment when the information could reach the right hands. When Brennan had announced the bond match with the Alpha King, Lyra had understood immediately. Not what Brennan intended it to be. A way to place a docile ward in the palace where she could be useful as a political gesture while remaining completely powerless. What it could be, instead. She had packed her documentation in the hidden pocket of the plain traveling case she had been given for the journey. She had not fought the veil. She had not argued about the description. She had let Brennan say what Brennan needed to say to get her to that altar. Because Lyra had always understood that where you arrived mattered considerably more than how. When Kaelin lifted the veil, what he found beneath it was not what he had prepared for. The woman looking up at him had clear hazel eyes, the kind that were several colors depending on the light, and were currently doing the specific thing of being completely, directly, unambiguously focused on his face. Her features were composed and exact, the kind of face that a landscape painter would argue with themselves about before deciding it was the composition itself that made it compelling, rather than any individual element. She was not plain. She was, in the most literal possible sense, the most striking person in the room. Kaelin became aware, in the way that one sometimes became aware of things that had been happening for a while before conscious attention arrived, that the assembled court had gone very quiet. He became aware that Lord Brennan, positioned to his left in the first row of council lords, had a very specific quality of stillness. The stillness of a man who has made a calculation and is monitoring whether it is going to hold. He became aware that the Bond Elder was waiting for him to say the words. He looked at Lyra. She looked at him. "You knew," he said quietly. Not an accusation, an observation. "Yes," she said, equally quiet. "Your Grace. You knew what description he gave." "Yes." "And you came anyway." A pause. Something moved through her expression. Not quite amusement, not quite satisfaction, but the specific quality of someone whose calculation has just confirmed itself. "I had reasons," she said. The Bond Elder cleared his throat gently. Kaelin looked at the woman in front of him, then at Brennan, whose stillness had developed a quality of controlled tension. Then back at Lyra, whose eyes had not left his face. He said the words. The ceremony completed. The court erupted in the murmur of hundreds of people processing something unexpected simultaneously. Lord Brennan, Kaelin noted, did not look pleased, and in the moment before the formal proceedings moved them apart, the court's embrace of its new queen, the positioning for the record portrait, the controlled chaos of a state ceremony completing itself, Lyra leaned slightly toward him and said very quietly, "I need to speak with you privately, tonight, before anyone else does." He looked at her. "I have documentation," she said, "about Lord Brennan. It's why I'm here." The court had opinions about the new queen. They formed them in the hours between the ceremony and the evening's formal dinner, in the rapid, efficient way that courts formed opinions about new entrants, in small clusters, in significant glances, in the careful positioning of people who were deciding how to revise their understanding of the day's events. The consensus, such as it was. She was not what they had been told to expect. This was observable by every person in the room and was being processed accordingly. The description, plain and unremarkable, had come from Brennan's circle, and the discrepancy between that description and the actual woman was now circulating with the velocity of information that had obvious implications. Lord Brennan, meanwhile, had spent the hours after the ceremony doing what Lord Brennan did, moving through conversations with the practiced ease of a man who had been navigating court politics for 40 years, and who had already identified his next position before his current one was fully established. His current position, the veil description, had been a misunderstanding, a miscommunication from an overzealous envoy. He was delighted, of course, by the match. He had always known the girl to be exceptional. Several council lords appeared to find this plausible. Several did not. Kaelin, who had been watching from the specific vantage point of someone who has just had his entire assessment of a situation revised, was doing his own calculation. He had agreed to this match without meeting her. He had taken Brennan's description at face value because he had not considered that a man of Brennan's experience would lie about something so easily disproved at the moment of the ceremony. Which meant Brennan had not expected the lie to matter at that point. Which meant Brennan had a plan for what came after. A plan in which the truth of her appearance was irrelevant because something else would determine what happened next. Kaelin thought about this throughout the formal dinner, which was a long meal he did not taste. Across the table, Lyra ate with the ease of someone who had been managing state dinners mentally before she was ever invited to one, spoke to her neighboring council lords in the precise register of engaged but not revealing, and, at one point, made a comment about the eastern border trade levy structures that caused the council lord to her right to go very still. Kaelin watched her. She caught him watching. She held his gaze for the space of one breath. Then she looked back at the council lord and continued her sentence. The private meeting happened at the 9th bell. His study. 2 guards outside the door. Lyra arrived with the plain traveling case. She opened it, removed a bound record of documents that she placed on his desk with the care of someone handling something they had been protecting for a very long time. "Brennan's border levy collection," she said. 3 years of records. What was officially collected versus what was officially reported versus what actually reached the Eastern Pac communities. Kaelin did not touch the documents yet. He looked at her. "You've been collecting this since I was 21, she said. "I found the first discrepancy by accident. Once I knew what I was looking at, the pattern became clear." "Why didn't you report it?" "To whom?" she said. "I was a ward with no standing, no allies, and no pack bond in his household. Every formal channel runs through council lords, the majority of whom have been benefiting from Brennan's arrangements for years." She met his eyes. "The only person this documentation could reach who had both the authority and the independence to act on it was you." "And to reach me," Kaelin said slowly, "you needed to be here." "Yes. Brennan gave you that. The bond match." "He believed he was placing a compliant ward in a comfortable position where she would be grateful and quiet," Lyra said. "He's been making that assessment of me for 3 years. I've tried not to correct it." Kaelin looked at the documents, then at her. "You used his own strategy against him," he said. "He described me as plain and unremarkable to ensure you wouldn't take me seriously," she said. "He didn't consider that you might take those descriptions at face value and simply agree to the match without meeting me, which meant I arrived here without him ever having a reason to stop me. Why would he need to stop you? You had no standing to bring this forward independently." "I had no standing," she agreed, "until this morning." He understood. "You're the Alpha Queen now," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." The study was very quiet. Kaelin picked up the documentation. He began to read. He read for a long time. Lyra sat across from him without speaking, with the specific patience of someone who had been waiting 3 years for this particular moment and did not intend to rush it now that it had arrived. The documentation was thorough, the kind of thorough that came from 3 years of careful, methodical work by someone who understood that incomplete evidence would be easier to dismiss than no evidence at all. She had not left gaps. She had cross-referenced everything. She had made the pattern unavoidable. Brennan had been redirecting border levy funds for at minimum 8 years. The scale of it was significant. The people most affected were the Eastern Pac communities, the Omegas, the lower-ranking Betas, the Packless Wanderers who depended on the territorial levy distribution for basic resources. "How many people knew you were keeping this?" Kaelin asked. "No one," she said. "I didn't trust anyone in that house." "Were you right not?" 2. "Every person in Lord Brennan's household," she said, "was someone he had selected, employed, or had leverage over. So yes, I believe I was right." He set down the last page. "This is sufficient for a formal council proceeding," he said. "More than sufficient." "Yes. Brennan will challenge it." "He'll challenge the source," she said. "He'll argue I'm a disgruntled ward with a grudge and no formal standing to bring a claim." "You have formal standing now." "I do," she said. "Which is why tonight matters. Before he understands what I've brought and has time to build his counterposition." Kaelin looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him. He had spent the entire day revising his understanding of what this day was. He had thought it was a political arrangement with a plain, compliant ward who would be present at state occasions and absent from state decisions. What it was, it turned out, was the day the most dangerous person he had ever encountered walked through his bond hall doors with 3 years of careful documentation, hidden in a plain traveling case, wearing a veil she hadn't argued about because she had already decided the veil was irrelevant. "You knew I would read it tonight," he said. "I hoped," she said. "I calculated that a king who makes good decisions would want to understand what I was bringing before Brennan had time to position against it. I thought that calculation was likely to be correct." "You were taking a significant risk." "Yes," she said. "I've been taking a significant risk for 3 years. This was the conclusion of it." "And if I had been the kind of king who wouldn't listen?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then I would have found another way," she said. "There is always another way. I've had 3 years to think about contingencies." The summons went to Brennan at the first bell of the following morning. Formal, sealed, the Alpha King's personal mark. The council assembled at the second bell, not the full council, which would have given Brennan time to prepare his allies. The inner council. The 6 lords whose independence from Brennan's arrangements Kaelin had confirmed, carefully through the night. Brennan arrived with the composure of a man who had been managing difficult situations for 40 years and had not yet identified this as one he couldn't manage. He saw Lyra seated to the Alpha King's left. His composure remained intact. Professionals did not show the first crack in public. Kaelin placed the documentation on the council table. "Lord Brennan," he said, "the council has a matter to address." What followed was 3 hours of the specific, grinding work of formal accountability. The presentation of evidence, the challenge, the counter-evidence, the point-by-point dismantling of a 40-year arrangement that had been built carefully enough that dismantling it required equal care. Brennan was good. He was very good. He challenged Lyra's documentation on 4 separate grounds, all of them technically coherent, none of them sufficient, because she had anticipated all 4. For each challenge, she produced the corresponding counter-evidence from the traveling case, which she had carried into the council chamber herself, and which sat, throughout the proceedings, on the table in front of her, with the quiet certainty of something that knew it was going to win. Kaelin watched her work. He had been a student of how people handled pressure since he was 17 years old, because handling pressure was the core competency of leadership, and you learned it by watching everyone around you do it well or badly. He had seen good counsel work before. He had seen brilliant legal minds dismantle complicated arguments under conditions of significant stress. He had never seen anything like this. She was not performing confidence. She had it, the specific, grounded kind that came not from certainty that everything would go right, but from having prepared so thoroughly that she had a response to every way it could go wrong. When Brennan, in the 3rd hour, made his most significant argument, that the documentation had been compiled by a ward with no formal standing, using access she was not authorized for, serving an agenda of personal grievance, Lyra let him finish. Then she said, the documentation was compiled using records that every member of the household had legal access to, organized according to cross-references that the records themselves provide, and verified against the official levy submissions that are public record in the Eastern Territory Council archive. Lord Brennan is welcome to identify any document in this record that was obtained improperly. She opened the case. "I'll wait," she said. Brennan looked at the case, then at the Alpha King, then at the 6 council lords who were not his allies, and who were looking at the documentation with the expressions of men who had just understood something important about how their territory had been operating. "This council," Kaelin said quietly, "will recess for consideration. Lord Brennan, you are asked to remain in the capital pending the outcome." The guards moved. Brennan was not arrested. Not yet. The process was formal, and it would move at the pace that formal processes moved. But he was no longer managing the situation, and everyone in the room understood that. The council proceedings took 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, several things happened simultaneously in the way that significant shifts tend to happen, not one at a time, but in a cascade, each one enabled by the one before. Brennan's eastern border arrangements were formally investigated. 3 additional council lords were found to have participated in the levy redirection. The funds, the ones that could be traced and recovered, began the process of being returned to the Eastern Pact communities. The communities themselves sent representatives to the capital. Kaelin received them in the formal audience hall. Lyra sat beside him. She spoke to them in the Eastern Pact dialect. The council lords in attendance watched this and recalibrated their assessments in real time. In those 6 weeks, Kaylin and Lyra also had a series of conversations that were difficult to categorize. Not formal, they had those structured meetings about the proceedings and the political situation and the practical management of what was happening, but the other kind. The kind that happened in the margins of formal days, in the space between one obligation and the next, in the study where she had placed the documents on his desk, and he had read them through the night. He asked her one evening what she had planned to do if he had turned out to be a different kind of king. "I had 17 contingencies," she said. 17. I may have been thorough. "Tell me 3 of them." She told him 3. They were all better than what most people would have managed with access to a palace and no allies. "You've been planning for failure your entire life," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I've been planning for every outcome. Failure is one of them." "Is that what it was like?" "In Brennan's house. It was—" She stopped, started differently. "When you have no power, and you understand that clearly, you have 2 options. You can despair of what you don't have, or you can become extraordinary at using what you do." "What did you have?" "Time," she said. "Access to records, a good memory, and the specific advantage of being underestimated by everyone around me." "He called you plain." "He believed it," she said. "I don't think it was malicious. I think he looked at me and genuinely saw what he expected to see. People tend to." "I did," Kaylin said. She looked at him. "You didn't look." "No," he said. "I didn't." "You looked tonight," she said. "At the proceedings. I noticed. You were difficult not to notice." Something moved in her expression, a slight shift, something that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else, but was in the neighborhood of both. "That was always available to anyone who cared to look," she said. "Most people didn't." "Their mistake," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "It was." The formal proceedings concluded on a Tuesday in the first weeks of winter. Brennan's arrangements were formally dismantled. The redistribution process began. 3 council lords faced formal censure. The eastern communities received formal apology and the beginning of restitution. Brennan himself was stripped of his border lordship and confined to his family's oldest estate, not imprisoned, because the political mathematics of the moment didn't support imprisonment, and Lyra had advised, when Kaylin had asked her view, that permanent, visible, irrevocable loss of power was a more effective consequence than imprisonment that could be framed as martyrdom. "He spent 40 years building," she had said, "watching it be taken apart methodically while he lives to see it. That's the right consequence." "That's a specific kind of ruthlessness," Kaylin had said. "It's accurate," she had said. "I prefer accurate to ruthless." He had laughed. It had surprised them both. On the last evening before the winter court began, the formal start of the 2nd season of the reign, which would now be defined significantly by what had happened in the weeks since the ceremony, Kaylin found Lyra in the library. She was reading. He had discovered, a habit of treating the palace library as though it belonged to her, which it now technically did, and which she seemed to find genuinely delightful. "You're smiling," he said. "I'm in a library with access to the actual border treaty documents from the Coldwater negotiations," she said. "I've been wanting to read these for 4 years. He sat across from her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You own the library," she said without looking up from the document. "You can ask anything you like." "We technically own it," he said. She looked up then. Something in her expression acknowledged this in a way that was still, he suspected, calibrating, the specific internal adjustment of someone who had spent their entire life as someone else's ward and was still learning what it meant to have arrived somewhere permanent. "What do you want to ask?" she said. He had spent 6 weeks watching her work, watching her speak to Eastern Pac representatives in their own dialect and dismantle Brennan's legal arguments and advise on consequence and redistribution and the practical architecture of fixing what had been broken for a generation. He had spent 6 weeks discovering that the match he had agreed to without looking, the plain, unremarkable, compliant ward who would be present at ceremonies and absent from decisions, was the most consequential decision he had made in 11 years of rule. Not because of the documentation, not because of what she had accomplished in 6 weeks. because of what it was like, for the first time in 11 years of ruling alone, to have someone who was actually in the room. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what you planned, not the contingencies, what you actually want. Now that you're here." She was quiet for a long moment. The library was warm with the first winter fires. Outside the tall windows, snow was beginning. The specific, quiet fall of the first winter snow, the kind that muffled everything and made the palace feel enclosed. "I want to finish what I started," she said. "The eastern communities, the restitution is beginning, but the structural changes that prevent it from happening again are more complicated. That will take time." "And?" "And I want to read the Coldwater Treaty documents," she said. "There's something in the border clause structure that I think has been misread for 20 years. "And?" She looked at him steadily. "And I want—" She stopped. Started again with the specific, careful honesty of someone who had spent years being strategic about what she revealed. "I want to not have to hide what I'm thinking from the person I'm sitting across from." He held her gaze. "You've been hiding it for 3 years. In that house, yes, extensively. You don't have to here." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm still learning what that feels like." "What does it feel like so far?" She looked at the fire for a moment. "Strange," she said. "Like a muscle that hasn't been used. You know it's there. You know it should work. But you have to convince it that it's safe to." He looked at her. At the woman who had walked down his bond hall in a borrowed gown and a thick veil and no attendants, with 3 years of hidden documentation in a plain traveling case, having calculated 17 contingencies for every way it could go wrong. Who had looked only at him through the veil. Who had, when he lifted it, met his eyes with the specific steadiness of someone who had already made their decision and was simply executing it. "It's safe," he said, for the record. The corner of her mouth moved. "I'll take that under consideration," she said. 17 contingencies, he said. "At minimum," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll aim to be a better outcome than any of them." She looked at him. The hazel eyes, several colors depending on the light, and currently warm in the firelight, in a way that had nothing to do with political calculation and everything to do with something simpler and considerably harder to manage. "You already are," she said. Then she looked back at the treaty document. "The Coldwater Border Clause," she said. "Look at Article 7, the secondary provision. Tell me if you see what I see." He pulled his chair around to her side of the table. He looked at Article 7. He saw what she saw. He stopped. "That's been misread for 20 years. "Yes," she said. "It has." They worked for 3 hours. The fire burned down and was rebuilt by the guard who checked at the second bell, and found, without apparent surprise, that the Alpha King and his new queen were still working. Outside, the first winter snow continued to fall. Inside the library, 2 people who had been introduced by a lie were discovering, in the methodical and unhurried way of things that were going to last, exactly what it meant to actually see each other. He agreed to marry a plain, unremarkable ward. She walked in with hazel eyes and 3 years of hidden evidence. He lifted the veil, and the life he had planned fell completely apart. Not into ruin, into something better, something real, built on the specific, irrevocable truth that the most important decisions are the ones you make before you know what you're deciding. He had chosen without looking, and somehow, impossibly, he had chosen right.